10th chapter. We'd gotten down actually to verse 9, but starting in verse 5, you have a section that goes through verse 19 dealing with Assyria shall be judged. That Assyria is really the tool in destroying Israel. But he's setting forth, at least initially, Assyria's pride and their intent to destroy Israel. But it's really, as we saw in verse 5, God using them to punish Israel, to bring judgment upon them. In verse 8, even before really, he's dealing with the aspect of his greatness, that's dealing with Assyria's greatness, that his princes formerly were kings. In other words, he had defeated all these nations, and the kings of those nations were now princes in his realm. And that brings us to verse 9. This is all dealing, though, while he's boasting and giving all of this that he has done, it is for the purpose of dealing with Jerusalem. And so he mentions in verse 9, is not Calno as Carchemish, is not Hamath as Arpad, is not Samaria as Damascus. He lists 6 cities here. All of them had been conquered by Assyria. And the aspect that Assyria is getting to is even the strongest of cities that you see here, they've not been able to withstand Assyria. Assyria has conquered them. So the conclusion and what he's asking is, if they could not withstand us, how do you expect Israel to withstand us? We were able to defeat these strong cities. You think you're going to stop us? And so that's the idea that he is presenting in this. The listing that he gives moves geographically from the northeast to the southwest, always drawing closer to Judah and Jerusalem. So let's see, if I could give an illustration in relationship to Pensacola and say, here's Los Angeles, and then Phoenix, and then Dallas, and then Mobile, and you think Pensacola is going to be able to do anything? That's kind of the idea that is being presented. It's getting closer to them with each one, and it's the major cities of those areas. To conclude, Jerusalem, you're not going to be able to do anything either. And so in verse 10, and it quit working. As my hand hath found the kingdoms of the idols, and whose graven images did excel them of Jerusalem and Samaria. This is a further threat to Jerusalem. And not only to Jerusalem, but to Jerusalem's God. that Jerusalem's God is inferior to these other gods, the gods of those kingdoms, the idols that are there. And if Assyria was able to vanquish those nations and thus their gods, then they will be able in relationship to Jerusalem. Assyria was working on the premise, and it was a common premise that not just Assyria, but basically all of the nations at that time, that military performance is related directly to the nation's God. So if nation A over here defeats nation B, then nation's A God is greater and more powerful than nation B's God. And so this is the idea of, here's my hand hath found the kingdoms of the idols. And I've defeated all of them, because Assyria's gods are greater than the gods of any of these nations. And he's also hinting at, even though it's not specifically, well, it is in the latter part, whose graven images did excel them of Jerusalem and of Samaria, that those nations' gods were greater and more powerful than Jerusalem's God and Samaria's God. And thus, since those nations were greater and their gods greater than Jerusalem's and Samaria's, and the military might is in direct proportion to the greatness of the God, if we defeated theirs and they are greater than yours, then we'll defeat yours. So if you have, let's just use an A, B, and C. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then what's A in relationship to C? It's greater. That's the premise, and that's what he's saying in relationship to the gods, that are the idols of the nations and Jehovah. That our God defeated these gods are greater than your God, so we're going to defeat you too. Again, you're seeing in these statements the arrogance of Assyria. They are boastful, prideful people, and from a military standpoint and the nations that they've already defeated, they kind of had a right to be. But they don't realize who they're dealing with. So in verse 11, shall not I, as I have done unto Samaria and her idols, so do Jerusalem and her idols. So at the time in which Assyria is stating this, Assyria had already defeated Samaria, and thus that northern kingdom. Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And they're using the idea unto Samaria and her idols. Their thinking is that Jehovah, or Yahweh, is simply another idol, just like the idols of all of the other nations. Since Samaria and Jerusalem have the same God, if we defeated Assyria, then what does that mean in relationship to Jerusalem? We'll defeat you. So that is what they're saying here. That's their thinking. And you can also see through this that Assyria has absolutely no thought, does not even entertain the possibility of failure. Does that remind you of something that Solomon wrote about pride? Going before destruction, haughty spirit before fall. They don't even entertain the possibility that they'll fail, because they consider Israel's God no more than the idols of other nations. They do not think that there is anything special in relationship to Yahweh or Israel's God. And so since we defeated these others, we'll defeat you as well, because our God's greater than your God.
That's what Paul was warning us in 1 Corinthians 10, 12, 12, 10, he is thinking you stand and take heed lest you fall.
1 Corinthians 10:12. Chapter 12 is the miraculous gifts or powers. Chapter 10 is what you're thinking of. The wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall.
We can get that way ourselves, like we're all right.
It is a warning to us. And if you go back in that same context in 1 Corinthians 10, actually if you go back to the latter couple of verses of chapter 9, Paul is talking about himself and his need to buffet his own body lest he be a castaway. And then he uses Israel as an illustration, and the conclusion in verse 12, you better be careful yourself if you think, beware lest you think you stand and you're going to fall. There's that prideful arrogance that basically says, I don't have to worry about anything. There's no temptation that can overcome me. I won't succumb to any of it. And so that warning, take heed. What Assyria did not realize is that God was using them to accomplish his purpose. Now, his purpose was to punish first Samaria and then Judea, or the southern kingdom, and thus Jerusalem. But afterwards, after God had accomplished what he wanted by using them in this way, that he would then turn around and punish them. Or in reality, he would destroy them and their power. And he's going to do so based upon these very things, their pride and arrogance. And to be able to say, our God's greater than your God. Well, God's going to bring them down and show them, no, that's not the case. I was simply using you to accomplish a purpose that I wanted, but I was using you. And now then you're going to be taken care of. You're going to be destroyed. Carl? Not simply that. Not simply because of the idols. That's part of it. It's that entire mentality of that time, though. If you go back even before this time, hundreds of years, even the period of the judges, you see the same principle and nations working upon that principle. Let's go battle the Israelites in the plains. Why? Because their God is God of the mountains. because they had already been defeated in the mountains. So, well, it must be all right to go to the plains. And we'll be able to defeat them in the plains because God is God of the mountains, not of the plains. So you have that even during the period of the judges. In relationship to Assyria, that's going to be obviously part of the reason that God is going to destroy them, but certainly not all of the reason. It's going to be because of their wickedness, their cruelty, the way in which they treat others. So it's going to be a combination of things. Oh, you're talking about as far as Jerusalem. No, this is, understand, this is being stated from Assyria's viewpoint, not necessarily Jerusalem's. Samaria did worship idols, the northern kingdom. They were brought down into Jerusalem and the southern kingdom at times, but I don't know, and I just don't remember right now if at this specific time they were. But I'm not sure that I would read the plural idols here in relationship to that, because this is Assyria talking, not necessarily God. Yeah. That might be just it, that they're just using it in a generic standpoint. Just like the idols of all these other nations, Jerusalem's idols isn't going to stop us either. So in verse 12, well, that was verse 12. Andrew, if you'll move that up some so that kind of gets it to us. Wherefore it shall come to pass that when the Lord hath performed his whole work upon Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, I will punish the fruit of the stout heart of the king of Assyria and the glory of his high looks. So here's the statement, really, as to what we've been saying this entire time. God is now speaking and saying, when I've performed this that I wanted to do, the whole work upon Mount Zion and on Jerusalem. In other words, when I have punished, I've accomplished punishing Jerusalem by using the Assyrians to do this. After I've accomplished what I wanted to accomplish by this, then I'm going to punish the Assyrians. I'm going to destroy them. And he mentions here, because of I will punish the fruit of the stout heart, the glory of his high looks. There's the pride and arrogance, and the reason thus that God is going to destroy them. Now, elsewhere we find other things, but at this point, what he's dealing with is their pride and arrogance. So verse 13. And Andrew, you'll have to keep moving it for us. So, for he saith, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I am prudent, and I have removed the bounds of the people and have robbed their treasures, and I will put down the inhabitants like a valiant man. Here is Assyria's boasting and pride again. Notice the number of times you see the personal pronoun here. By the strength of my hands, I have done it. By my wisdom, for I am prudent, I have removed the bounds of the people and have robbed their treasures, and I have put down the inhabitants like a valiant man. 6 times the personal pronoun dealing with, look at what I've done. Look at how great I am. Look at how strong I am.
Makes you think of that guy who tore down his barn to build others, or said I, me, and my all the time.
Well, there's that one. There's a lot of times in which you see that type of an attitude. I was thinking of the elder son in the parable of the prodigal son. It was another illustration, as well as that which my crops have been, so great. I'll pull down my barns, I'll build bigger barns, and I'll say to myself, take thine ease, eat, drink, be merry. So there's a lot of times in which you deal with people like that. Do you ever know, or do you know of anyone, who, if you start talking to them about anybody or anything, it always comes back to me and what I've done and what I do, or how I feel, or what, it's always about me. Doesn't matter who you start with, it's always comes back to me. Well, that's kind of like Assyria is here. I've done this. And they're claiming this success that they enjoyed, a result of their military might. Someone turn over to Isaiah chapter 37 and read verse 24 for us. And just as before that, this is Sennacherib, who is king of Assyria. He's speaking here. So Isaiah 37, verse 24.
By your servants you have reproached the Lord and said, by the multitude of my chariots I have come up to the height of the mountain, to the limits of Lebanon. I will cut down its tall cedars and its choice cypress trees. I will enter its furthest height to its fruitful forest, and I again after that.
So it's all me. I've done this. I will do this. Well, that's Assyria. And they're thinking.
The Bible says to trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own.
Well, we know that, but obviously Assyria trusted their own power, their own strength, their own greatness, and they thought everything that they did was their own. Their own wisdom, their own understanding. We're so wise, so knowledgeable, that you can't defeat us. We're so powerful you can't do anything. And they took pride, the idea of I have removed the bounds of the people. That's basically, they're taking pride in removing the boundaries of the nations that they conquered. Turn over to 2 Kings chapter 17. And in verses 24 through verse 26, it says that the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and from Saravathan, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. And so it was at the beginning of their dwelling there that they feared not the Lord, therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which slew some of them. Wherefore they spake to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations which thou hast removed and placed in the cities of Samaria know not the manner of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and behold, they slay them, because they know not the manner of the God of the land. So here's the king of Assyria, and he takes people from Babylon, from all of these other cities, and he transplants them into the cities of Samaria. That's the idea of he has removed the bounds of the people. In other words, the boundaries of these nations, they're no longer, because now then those other nations are living in the land. And in this, it goes on, they didn't know God and the manners of God, what God desired, and so they transgressed God's will as far as that land, and God sends lions among them and destroys some of them. Why? Because now then these people from foreign lands were in the land, living there, transplanted by the king of Assyria. So the boundaries of those nations were no more. And no doubt, probably a lot of us would love to get into discussion on that in relationship to the boundaries that we should be having within our nation, that we see continually being broken down. But we won't get into discussion of that tonight. But anytime you lose the boundaries of a nation, you basically, and that was the thinking of the people of that time, you destroy the national identity of the people by transplanting other nations into that nation. When you have the people from this nation and this nation and this nation and this nation and all these different nations, and now then they're all living in this one land, the national identity of that land and of that people becomes destroyed. Well, we'll mention the aspect of when they then living in that land among the Israelites then began intermarrying with them, and you have, as a result of that intermarriage, the Samaritan people coming into existence. The Samaritans were half-breeds, half Israelites and half something else. Now, why was that? Because of what the king of Assyria did in transporting or transplanting these other nations into the land. So that's the idea. He's removed the bounds of the people. And let me just add, Samaria is not the only nation he did that to. Anytime a king would conquer lands like that, he intentionally did this to that land so that it would destroy the identity of that land, and thus he no longer has opposition from that land and that people. Why? Because people are all scattered abroad in other nations. So it makes it easier for him then to maintain control of that people and of that land. So that was the thinking behind it. That's also why the nations would not allow people to go back home, and why it becomes unusual for Cyrus the Great to allow the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem. Why? Kings didn't do that because of that very thing. And in reading Ezra and Nehemiah, you start seeing some of the opposition to what's going on in Jerusalem. What did they say? If you allow them to do this, they're rebellious people and they'll rebel against you and it will cost you money and you're going to... You see, that was the basis of their thinking. And their appeal to the Medo-Persian Empire to stop them from building the temple and later on the wall.
Well, don't we have that same thing in Europe and places like that? Where the one country is coming in, but they're not acquainting themselves with the pagans. They're bringing their laws and everything and corrupting the people that are there.
That's what we have in Europe, and that's what we're starting to have and see in the United States as well. And that's why I said we wouldn't try not to get off into that, because we would could stay on the politics of our nation at that point, and we really don't want to do that. But it is a good point, and that was the basis of their doing it back then. And we kind of do see the effects of it in some of the nations in Europe even today. He also... Okay, Dale.
Chapter 10, 8 through 10, and 28 to 31 are right on cue geographically and topography. It shows the Bible. It's got its ducks in a row on those areas, and it can't be legendary, because if you follow the line, it's just like it was set up. One city after another is in sequence. So
sounds like you're going back to verse 9, and the city is there. Yeah, they knew the lay of the land. But they lived there at that time. So he also mentions that he had robbed their treasuries. In other words, he took all of the money from them. The national treasuries and national treasures, he took it. And he considers himself a valiant man. He puts down the inhabitants and those who would be ruling. Sennacherib, who is the king of Assyria, and the Assyrians gave absolutely no credence to God, to honoring God. But as we mentioned, the 6 times the personal pronoun in this verse, one verse alone, claimed everything myself. I did it. So, as far as giving any honor to God, wasn't in their thinking. And yet God is the one who is in control and using them without their knowledge. In verse 14 then, you kind of continue seeing even in this the continued personal pronoun starting off, and my hand hath found as a nest the riches of the people, and as one gathereth eggs that are left, have I gathered all the earth, and there was none that moved the wing or opened the mouth or peeped. So you continue to see their arrogance and pride, but in this he's using figures of speech to emphasize the helplessness of the rest of the world. All of the other nations are helpless against us, is what he's saying. Because I am so great. The me and I doing this. Or my hand is doing it. The nations and their riches are likened to eggs in an unguarded nest for him. Here's a nest that's not even guarded, and to go and pluck the eggs. That's the way all of the nations are around, and all of their riches. If I want it, I go and take it. Nobody can stop me. Nobody can hinder me because of my greatness. And so all Assyria, in this case, had to do was to reach in and take the eggs. And Assyria did so without, as they think of it, without any resistance. Not by deed. That's the idea of moving the wing. Or verbal, by mouth or feet. So no one would lift, as we might say, lift a finger. Nobody would lift a finger against us. And nobody would say anything about it. I'm sure the nations that they had conquered, though, would disagree a little bit with that, don't you think? Even though they were defeated, don't you think they would say, oh, we fought them tooth and toenail, and they had to fight like everything just to get an inch from us. That would have been their view. Assyria's view, they didn't offer any resistance at all. I just did whatever I wanted to. When I was ready to go in and take the land, I went in and took it. And they didn't offer any resistance.
Easy for him to talk with all his bodyguards and all his soldiers around him.
Well, it was easy for him to talk because he was the victor.
Yeah.
There's a lesson that you learn through history, that the victor writes the history. Whoever is the victor, they're the ones who write the history of it. Assyria was the victors. So who wrote the history? The Assyrians. And there wasn't much that the other nations could do about it. But that's just a general principle. It always happens. If you could go back to World War I, World War II, those wars, know a little bit more about World War II, so I'll use that. If you look at Europe, and France in particular, they won the war. If you ask those from England, they're the ones who won the war. If you look at the American history books, who won the war? We're the ones who won it. It's well, that's that's the American viewpoint of it. If you look at the French resistance is the one who won that battle and all those battles, and they're free because of the French resistance, not of anything that the Americans did. We helped out a little bit, but we were minor in it. And the English, they were the ones who did everything. So the victor writes the history. In this case, because you have different nations joining together in an alliance, they each write their own. But if you could take a actual history of it from the Germans, wouldn't their history be a lot different than what ours would be? Well, of course it would. If they had won the war, would it have been, the history books have been different? as to what took place and what happened, and each of those battles that took place? Well, that's the whole point. These nations had been defeated. Now then, Sennacherib and the Assyrians are writing the history, and they're saying, these nations, they didn't put up any resistance. They couldn't put any resistance up because we're so great and powerful.
I think there's a word in here that we learned. My mom did. I've heard that saying many a time. I don't want to hear it.
Yeah, I don't want to hear a peep. And you know, when parents told their children, I don't want to hear a peep out of you, guess what the children did? Their mouths became shut. That's the same idea here. These nations, their mouths were shut. They didn't offer a peep of resistance. That's a good illustration. I think that was a common Southern statement, and probably Northern, and probably some other nations as well.
You're a pig to get around the bell.
Carl.
Went back to where when Germany was just taking everything over and was reading the history then, you know, when they was afraid that they could, the French and them, they said they couldn't stop us. They couldn't stop us.
Yeah, that's the whole point. Whoever's the victor at the time, they're the ones who write that history. Now then, what we do now, though, is we go back and rewrite it to make it accommodate whatever we want today. But that's another story. Well, instead of getting into verse 15, we'll stop here. And then in a couple of weeks, we'll pick up, because next week I'll be gone, and so Brother Bush is going to be teaching the class next week.